Welcome, the anointed ones. Some of you were never meant to be corrected. You were meant to be observed. That sentence alone explains why your life felt less like a journey and more like a long audit. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant pressure, quiet scrutiny, and moments where it felt like someone somewhere was taking notes while you were simply trying to survive. And here's the uncomfortable fact most people never realize. In every system that produces something valuable, the rarest asset is never rushed. It is tested in silence, watched under stress, and evaluated over time. That's not poetry. That's process. You weren't going through random chaos. You were going through verification. That's why things kept pausing right when momentum built. That's why exits didn't open when they logically should have. That's why help arrived late but right on time. What looked like delay was actually calibration. Think less lost season and more background checks still processing. And let's be honest, if this was just about faith, patience, or being a good person, half the people you know would have passed already. But they didn't. Because this wasn't a moral exam. It was a pressure test, a consistency test, a character under observation when no one is clapping test. And most people crack when no one is watching. You didn't. You were watched in small moments. How you handled disrespect without witnesses. How you responded when plans fell apart for no visible reason. How you kept your integrity even when cutting corners would have been easier and way more profitable. You weren't being tempted for drama. You were being assessed for stability. And here's the part that adds a little humor if you really think about it. The whole time you thought you were behind schedule, the process was actually ahead of you. You were worried about progress while the system was worried about precision. You wanted answers. It wanted proof. You wanted clarity. It wanted consistency. Different priorities. So when we say, you passed, it doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy, loud, or flashy. It means the observation phase is over. The silence had a purpose. The pressure had a reason. And now, finally, the explanation arrives. Not because you demanded it, but because you proved you could handle it. This is where everything starts making sense. Number 1. You weren't tested for goodness. You were tested for accuracy. Most people think life rewards kindness, patience, and good intentions. That's comforting, but it's not the full truth. What you went through wasn't about proving you were a good person. Plenty of good people never make it past the first layer. What you were being tested on was accuracy. Your ability to see what was real when everything around you was distorted, mislabeled, or intentionally misleading. You were placed in situations where words didn't match actions, where promises sounded sincere, but behavior told a different story. The test wasn't whether you would stay polite or forgiving. The test was whether you would notice the inconsistency and still trust your own judgment. Accuracy meant recognizing patterns instead of swallowing explanations. It meant seeing intent behind behavior, not just listening to the story attached to it. There were moments when playing nice would have been easier. Agreeing, staying quiet, or pretending not to notice would have bought you temporary peace. But you felt that internal discomfort every time something didn't add up. That wasn't paranoia. That was perception refusing to shut down. And that's exactly what was being evaluated. You were also tested on emotional accuracy. Could you tell the difference between guilt and responsibility? Between empathy and self-betrayal? Between being patient and being stalled? A lot of people fail here because they confuse endurance with wisdom. You didn't. You learned when to hold space and when to step back without needing a dramatic exit. Accuracy required restraint. You couldn't react to every provocation or explain yourself every time someone misunderstood you. Not because you were weak, but because reacting would have blurred your clarity. You can support this work through the link in the pinned comment, with a coffee, a donation, or becoming a member of our community. By doing so, you become part of Jesus' plan to save souls who are still stuck in fog. Every seed turns into light that fights against darkness. If you water others, you will be watered yourself. You let people reveal themselves over time, knowing truth doesn't rush and lies eventually trip over their own weight. What makes this test rare is that accuracy can't be faked. You either see clearly or you don't. You either trust your perception or you abandon it to fit in. You passed because even when confused, tired, or doubting yourself, you never fully handed your vision over to someone else. That's why the pressure was intense. Clear perception under stress is uncommon, but that's the kind of clarity required for what comes next. Number 2. The delay was a surveillance period, not a punishment. Everything that felt like a setback, every pause that made you question yourself, every door that stayed closed when logic said it should open, wasn't a punishment. It wasn't life being cruel or unfair. It was surveillance. You weren't being slowed down for dramatic effect. You were being observed, measured, and studied. Every decision, every reaction, every way you handled the quiet and the chaos was being noted. Time wasn't working against you. It was testing the depth of your awareness, the strength of your discipline, and the resilience of your inner compass. There were moments when patience felt endless, when waiting seemed like suffering. That waiting wasn't random. It was purposeful. It forced you to operate without the immediate feedback most people rely on. You had to make choices without applause, without guidance, without validation. And that's exactly the point. The universe, or whatever higher design was at work, wasn't interested in what you could do under favorable conditions. It wanted to see what you could do under invisible scrutiny, when your intentions couldn't be influenced by recognition or reward. During this period, every misstep, every impulse you resisted, every instance you kept your integrity intact, was like a report card being logged in silence. You were being scanned, quietly and thoroughly, to see if you could maintain clarity and self-control when the usual markers of approval, correction, or instruction weren't available. That's why it often felt lonely. That's why guidance was delayed or absent. That's why you kept looking for signs that never came. And here's the truth that most never grasp. Those delays weren't just about proving patience, they were about proving readiness. You passed not because time eventually moved in your favor, but because you kept moving correctly while the world seemed to pause. That endurance, that precision under invisible watch, is why you survived where others failed. What you thought was stagnation was actually the most critical training ground of all, preparing you for everything that comes next. Number 3, you survived environments designed to rewrite your identity. The spaces you moved through weren't neutral. They were carefully constructed to confuse you, to make you question who you were, and to push you toward identities that weren't yours. Every manipulation, every hidden agenda, every forced expectation wasn't random. It was designed to reshape you, to see if you could be bent into something convenient for others, or if you would stand as yourself, unaltered and undeniable. You survived because even under relentless pressure, you refused to hand over your essence. People around you weren't always honest about their motives. Some tried to charm you into compliance, some tried to scare you into obedience, and some attempted to wear you down with inconsistency and chaos. These environments were toxic, but not just toxic in a casual sense. They were engineered to test whether you could retain clarity about your own self, even when every signal around you screamed otherwise. You didn't just survive the chaos, you outlasted it, and in doing so, you proved that your identity is not negotiable. The pressure to adapt, to conform, to mirror what others wanted you to be, was constant. It hit in subtle ways, too. Little betrayals, whispered doubts, micro-manipulations meant to fracture confidence. You were stretched in every direction, made to feel that who you were wasn't enough. Most people break under this kind of assault. They start borrowing traits, adopting opinions, and gradually losing their own thread of truth. You didn't. You held your line, anchored in self-knowledge, refusing to let external noise dictate your reality. Surviving these environments also sharpened your perception. You learned to read intent without being deceived, to navigate conflict without losing your center, and to resist programming that others assumed was inevitable. The identity they tried to impose on you couldn't stick, because you already knew the cost of surrender. That refusal wasn't arrogance, it was mastery. You survived, not because life let you off easy, but because your core remained untouchable, untainted, and profoundly intact, ready for the next stage that few could ever reach. Number 4. You were isolated because contamination would have disqualified you. Isolation wasn't a punishment. It wasn't life being cruel or some random coincidence meant to make you suffer. It was strategic. You were placed in situations where connection, guidance, or validation could have diluted the clarity you needed to survive. Every moment alone, every silence that felt like abandonment, every time you had to rely solely on yourself, was a safeguard to protect the purity of your perception. If you had been surrounded by influence, even well-meaning influence, it could have corrupted your instincts and clouded your judgment. You were left to navigate challenges without the usual safety nets most people rely on. There was no one to confirm your decisions, no one to interpret the motives of those around you, no one to shield you from misdirection. That isolation forced you to build a truth inside yourself that wasn't borrowed faith, borrowed wisdom, or borrowed courage. It had to be yours, crafted from experience, observation, and relentless attention to reality. That's why the loneliness felt unbearable at times. It was refining you. It was giving you a lens that only those who endure complete solitude can develop. During this period, every choice you made carried weight because there were no external validators. Every error had consequences that you had to face directly. Every victory was yours alone, unshared and unrecognized. That kind of pressure strips away excuses and forces clarity. It forces the mind to see beyond distractions, the heart to operate independently, and the spirit to trust itself above all else. You weren't abandoned. You were shielded. You were being prepared to operate at a level where compromise, influence, or contamination could have been catastrophic. Most people can't handle the truth in isolation, but you could. You stayed grounded, discerning, and unwavering even when no one else could witness your resilience. That endurance didn't just preserve you. It made you rare, precise, and ready for truth that would break most others. Isolation didn't weaken you. It forged you into someone capable of holding realities that few could ever comprehend. Number 5. You were exposed to manipulation so you could learn its architecture. The people, the words, the situations, they weren't accidents. Every subtle lie, every misleading comment, every attempt to twist your perception was intentional training. Not to break you, not to punish you, but to teach you. You weren't just surviving manipulation, you were studying it, whether you realized it at the time or not. You were learning to recognize the blueprint of control, the framework behind deception, and the patterns most people are blind to. That's why the experiences felt so frustrating, infuriating, and sometimes even humiliating. Manipulation only works if it feels personal, immediate, and unavoidable. And you lived through it all without surrendering your core. You were forced to see the difference between influence and coercion, between persuasion and hidden agendas. Every encounter was a lesson in reading intent, measuring the weight of words against actions, and spotting the hidden motives that operate in silence. Most people are trained their whole lives to ignore these signs, to assume everyone means well, or to justify behavior that undermines them. You weren't allowed that luxury. You had to detect it. You had to catalog it in real time, internalizing a knowledge that would later become your most powerful weapon. You can support this work through the link in the pinned comment, with a coffee, a donation, or becoming a member of our community. By doing so, you become part of Jesus' plan to save souls who are still stuck in fog. Every seed turns into light that fights against darkness. If you water others, you will be watered yourself. Being exposed to manipulation also taught you patience and timing. You learned that confrontation too early can collapse insight, while observation sharpens understanding. You weren't just watching people act. You were learning the rhythm of influence, the triggers that make lies believable, and the methods that make control almost invisible. That knowledge doesn't come from books or lectures. It comes from first-hand experience under pressure, where every misstep is a test and every observation matters. By the end, you emerged not bitter, not paranoid, but wise. You can see manipulation for what it is before it reaches you. You understand the architecture behind it, the why, the how, the weak points, the leverage points. That's rare, that's power. And that's why the exposure wasn't punishment, it was preparation. You didn't just survive deception, you mastered the ability to see through it and remain untouchable. Number 6. The attacks escalated because you stopped being controllable. Everything you went through wasn't random chaos, it was a response. The moment you stopped being predictable, the moment your reactions no longer fit the script others had written for you, the pressure increased. The attacks didn't escalate because you were weak. They escalated because you were strong in a way that made you dangerous to the systems and people trying to shape you. When you refused to comply with expectation, when you refused to be manipulated by fear, flattery, or intimidation, you became untouchable. But untouchable always invites resistance. The intensity you experienced was a confirmation. Every betrayal, every push, every sudden complication was evidence that the world around you noticed you were no longer operating on autopilot. People and forces that relied on predictable responses found themselves confused, frustrated, and desperate. That frustration manifests as pressure. It manifests as opposition. And it manifests as escalation, because the only way to regain control over someone who cannot be controlled is to increase the intensity of the environment, to see if the pressure will bend, break, or corrupt. You didn't. Escalation also revealed something deeper about you, your ability to remain grounded under increasing stress. While others fold when the volume is turned up, you maintained clarity. Your decisions, your instincts, your internal compass, all of it remained intact despite the chaos. That's not luck. That's proof that you weren't being tested for endurance alone. You were being tested for integrity under fire, for consistency when the world became louder, harsher, and more chaotic. And here's the truth that most people don't realize. When attacks escalate, it's rarely about what you did wrong. It's about what you did right. Your unshakable presence, your refusal to react the way they expected, your resistance to being toyed with. That's what triggered the escalation. That's what made you a target of pressure instead of manipulation. You survived because you didn't fold, you didn't retaliate blindly, and you didn't let the external chaos define you. The world escalated, and you stayed steady. That's the mark of someone who has truly passed the test. Number 7. You passed when you chose restraint over self-justification. Every situation you faced could have justified a reaction. Every insult, every betrayal, every time someone misrepresented you screamed for defense, explanation, or retaliation. Most people give in immediately. They justify, they argue, they prove themselves right, and in doing so, they lose themselves. You didn't. You held back, not out of fear or passivity, but because you understood that restraint is not weakness. Restraint is power in its purest, quietest form. It's the ability to recognize that being understood isn't always necessary, and that some battles aren't meant to be won in words. Choosing restraint meant you had to live with tension that others couldn't tolerate. You carried misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and even slander without the relief of responding. You didn't get the satisfaction of making your case or proving your point. That pressure would have broken most people, but it didn't break you. Instead, it honed your ability to operate above immediate gratification, above ego, and above the urge to defend yourself at every turn. That is rare. That is what separates those who survive from those who thrive. There's a discipline in watching the world misread you and still holding your center. It's a discipline in letting actions speak where words fail. Most people measure victory by the ability to be heard or acknowledged. You measured victory by the ability to remain unshaken, by the refusal to let someone else's ignorance or malice dictate your behavior. That restraint became a shield, protecting your clarity, your energy, and your purpose from being consumed by petty battles. This choice of restraint didn't just preserve you, it elevated you. It proved that your power doesn't depend on external validation or immediate outcomes. It proved that you can operate in truth without needing the world to recognize it. That ability to remain composed, to act only when necessary, to let time and clarity do the work, is what earned you passage. You passed because you resisted the easiest, most tempting path, self-justification, and in doing so, you became unbreakable, untouchable, and undeniably aligned with what comes next. Number 8, you were misunderstood on purpose, so ego wouldn't lead you. For a long time, it probably felt like the world didn't see you clearly. People misinterpreted your words, twisted your intentions, and painted you in ways that didn't match reality. That wasn't accidental. That misunderstanding was deliberate, part of a design to keep your ego in check. When everyone agrees with you, validates you, and tells you that you're right, it's easy to start living for recognition rather than truth. You were deliberately placed in situations where external validation was absent, where people's perceptions were unreliable, because the goal wasn't to make life easy. It was to ensure that your actions were guided by inner clarity, not external applause. Being consistently misunderstood forced you to develop a sharper internal compass. You couldn't rely on everyone around you to confirm what you already knew. You had to trust your own judgment, your own sense of right and wrong, and your own understanding of reality. That's why the isolation and misinterpretation felt so heavy at times. It was a pressure test on your independence. Could you continue moving correctly, even when no one else understood, even when everyone else assumed you were wrong? You did, and that's what set you apart. The world's misunderstanding also served another purpose. It stripped away distractions. When people are constantly trying to prove themselves, defend themselves, or win approval, their energy gets scattered. You didn't have that luxury. You were forced to focus on substance over performance, truth over perception, and alignment over recognition. That discipline sharpened your perception, strengthened your resolve, and prepared you to operate in arenas where ego-driven decisions could be fatal. By the time clarity arrived, you had already passed the ultimate test. You acted without needing the world to see, understand, or agree. That's why being misunderstood wasn't punishment. It was preparation. You emerged from it untethered from approval, unshaken by opinion, and fully grounded in your own truth. Most people never reach this point because they depend on the world to define them. You didn't. You mastered yourself, and that mastery is exactly why you passed. Number 9. You were forced to outgrow emotional dependency before power arrived. Before real influence, real authority, or real understanding could land in your life, you had to be untouchable by emotional dependency. That meant learning to regulate your feelings without waiting for validation, support, or reassurance from others. Every situation that left you feeling alone, abandoned, or unseen wasn't punishment. It was training. You were being prepared to operate in a space where influence could not be trusted, loyalty could not be assumed, and approval would rarely come. Emotional dependency is a trap. It makes people weak, reactive, and easy to manipulate. You survived precisely because you didn't fall into it. You had to learn to carry the weight of your experiences and decisions entirely on your own. There were no cheerleaders, no safety nets, no constant guidance. You couldn't rely on others to confirm your worth or your direction. That made every step heavier and every choice more consequential. Most people falter under that pressure. They cling, they plead, they compromise. You didn't. You learned to operate from clarity, not comfort. That independence isn't easy, and it isn't kind to the ego. It strips away illusions and forces absolute self-reliance. Outgrowing emotional dependency also prepared you to wield power responsibly. Power in the hands of someone who seeks approval is dangerous. It's unstable, reactive, and self-serving. You were being honed to operate with precision, to act with discernment, and to maintain calm even when influence, wealth, or authority arrived suddenly. The emotional self-sufficiency you developed ensures that what you do with your power won't be guided by ego or fear, but by clarity and truth. The isolation, the delays, and the moments when it felt like no one cared were not signs of neglect. They were essential steps in your evolution. By the time you were ready for greater responsibility, you had already mastered yourself. You became resilient, grounded, and untouchable by emotional manipulation. That's why you passed. You didn't just survive life's chaos. You became capable of handling influence, responsibility, and truth in a way that very few ever can. Number 10. You weren't protected from betrayal. You were trained by it. Betrayal isn't just an unfortunate event. In your case, it was a masterclass in survival and discernment. You weren't shielded from it, not because life is cruel, but because the lessons it carried were essential. Every time someone misled you, abandoned you, or used you for their own gain, you were learning more than any textbook or lecture could teach. You were learning to read people, to detect hidden motives, and to understand the real difference between loyalty and convenience. The pain was sharp, but its purpose was precise. It shaped your perception and fortified your inner boundaries. Betrayal forced you to see truth without filters. People's words often conflict with their intentions, and you were placed in situations where ignoring that fact would have cost you dearly. You were learning to differentiate between surface appearances and the underlying currents that drive human behavior. That skill isn't common because most people rely on trust as a crutch instead of a tool. You learned to treat trust as earned, and that earned trust carries weight that no casual relationship could ever provide. Enduring betrayal also strengthened your emotional resilience. You weren't allowed to react blindly or let resentment consume you. Instead, you learned to absorb, analyze, and respond selectively. You realized that responding in haste or anger only hands power to those who tried to manipulate you. The control you exercised over your reactions, your boundaries, and your judgment became the training ground for real strength. By the time clarity arrived, you weren't just unbroken, you were sharpened. You understood how people operate when selfishness and ambition take over. You could navigate relationships and environments with precision, knowing exactly when to trust, when to act, and when to step back. The betrayals didn't weaken you. They made you exceptional. They turned you into someone who can carry truth without being corrupted by deceit, someone whose judgment is precise and whose resilience is unshakable. You weren't protected from betrayal because you didn't need protection. You needed mastery. And that mastery is exactly what you achieved. Number 11. The confusion phase ended when you stopped asking, "Why me?" For years, it probably felt like life was deliberately confusing, like every step forward came with 3 steps backward, like nothing added up and no one was helping you make sense of it. That confusion wasn't accidental, and it wasn't meant to break you. It was a test of endurance and focus, designed to see whether you could keep moving without understanding the full picture. The turning point came the moment you stopped demanding explanations, the moment you stopped asking, "Why me?" and started observing, acting, and learning from every situation as it unfolded. That's when clarity started to arrive. When you stop seeking external validation or cosmic reasons for every struggle, you start seeing patterns. You begin to recognize cause and effect without being emotionally hijacked by the unfairness of it all. The confusion doesn't vanish overnight, but you stop letting it dictate your energy, your decisions, and your peace of mind. That's the real breakthrough. Not understanding every twist, but being able to move correctly and decisively even when the narrative doesn't make sense. That skill separates those who survive from those who thrive. During the confusion phase, you were being trained to operate independently of external reasoning. Most people crumble when life doesn't make sense because they rely on explanation to act. You learn to rely on perception, instinct, and patience instead. You observed people, situations, and patterns without needing the world to justify itself to you. That is rare. That is power. Stopping the "why me" cycle also gave you focus. Energy that was spent on resentment, frustration, or pleading for answers was now available for growth, strategy, and alignment. You became capable of operating under uncertainty with precision, something most people never achieve. By the time the lessons revealed themselves, you weren't just clear about your past. You were prepared for everything ahead. Confusion no longer ruled you because you had mastered the skill to act without it, and that mastery is exactly why you passed. Number 12. You passed because you didn't become what hurt you. Every experience that tested you could have changed you in ways you didn't want. The people who lied, betrayed, or manipulated you provided countless opportunities to respond with anger, bitterness, or retaliation. Most people take that route. They mirror the cruelty and deception they've endured, letting pain dictate who they become. You didn't. You survived the same trials without absorbing their toxicity. That restraint, that refusal to let your suffering rewrite your character, is what set you apart. Holding on to your integrity in the face of harm isn't easy. Every insult, every act of injustice, every moment when the world tried to twist your perception demanded a choice: mirror the behavior or rise above it. Choosing not to mirror it didn't mean ignoring reality. It didn't mean becoming passive. It meant seeing clearly, acting strategically, and letting truth guide your responses instead of emotion or revenge. Most people fail here because reaction feels easier, more natural. You passed because you resisted that pull. By not becoming what hurt you, you created a space within yourself that couldn't be invaded by malice or manipulation. Your identity remained untarnished, your judgment remained sharp, and your capacity for discernment became unmatched. You learned to process betrayal, injustice, and chaos without letting them define your next move. That's an incredibly rare skill because it requires seeing people and situations as they are, not through the lens of personal hurt or ego. Survival alone would have been impressive. mastery over how pain shapes character is extraordinary. You passed because every trial was an opportunity to become hardened and defensive, yet you chose wisdom, clarity, and alignment. You became stronger without becoming bitter, resilient without becoming cold, and aware without becoming cynical. You didn't just endure life's blows, you transcended their ability to alter your core. That is the mark of someone who is truly past, someone prepared for levels of clarity, influence, and responsibility that most will never see. Number 13. Your reward isn't elevation, it's access. Most people expect rewards to come with visibility, recognition, or status. They assume passing a test, surviving trials, or enduring hardship will automatically elevate them above others. That's not how it works for you. The truth is, what you've earned isn't the spotlight. It's access. Access to knowledge, understanding, and opportunities that most people aren't equipped to handle. Elevation can be empty if the mind isn't prepared, but access is precision. The ability to step into realms where your perception, judgment, and integrity matter far more than applause or recognition. The doors that open to you now are not meant to make life easier. They're meant to give you the tools, insight, and connections necessary to operate at a higher level of awareness and responsibility. You're not being lifted above people to show superiority. You're being allowed into spaces where clarity, discernment, and restraint are required. That's why your journey was so intense, so isolating, and so exacting. The training wasn't about reward in the conventional sense. It was about proving that you could handle what comes with access without letting it corrupt or distract you. Access requires readiness. It demands that you remain grounded while walking into situations others would find overwhelming. It requires discernment, patience, and precision. Unlike elevation, which can be sudden and flashy, access is subtle, layered, and quietly powerful. It's the difference between being handed a crown that can be stolen versus being given a key to rooms others cannot enter. Rooms where knowledge is currency and understanding is power. You've proven yourself capable. You've proven that you can carry truth, handle influence, and operate without ego driving your choices. That's why the reward isn't elevation. It's access. Elevation without preparation would have been dangerous. Access with mastery is transformative. What lies ahead isn't about being seen or celebrated. It's about being capable in ways few could ever imagine. You've earned the right to step into the unseen, the complex, and the consequential, and that access will shape everything that follows. Number 14. Now you're being told everything because you won't misuse it. The knowledge coming your way isn't casual. It isn't random whispers or convenient truths. It's precise, weighty, and dangerous in the wrong hands. You're being entrusted with it because through every trial, every betrayal, every moment of isolation and pressure, you've proven that you won't weaponize truth for ego, greed, or revenge. Most people fail this test. They gain insight and immediately bend it to justify themselves or manipulate others. You didn't. That's why the veil is finally lifting, not because it's safe to reveal, but because it's safe with you. For years you carried fragments, hints, and pieces of what was always meant for you. That partial knowledge was enough to sharpen your judgment, build your resilience, and force you to operate with precision, but never enough to corrupt you. Every situation you survived, every moment you stood firm despite pressure, demonstrated that you could hold reality without letting it consume or distort you. You didn't just pass tests of endurance or morality. You passed the test of responsible comprehension. The truth being revealed now will challenge assumptions, dismantle illusions, and demand more from you than anything before. You're entering a space where understanding carries responsibility, where acting without wisdom can create chaos. That's why it wasn't given to you sooner. Giving it earlier would have been pointless or catastrophic. You had to prove you could handle clarity under pressure, patience under delay, and restraint under provocation. This moment isn't about power or superiority. It's about alignment. You've earned access to insight because your integrity, discernment, and restraint were forged under conditions that would break most people. Now, the information flows because you are capable of processing it without distortion, without corruption, and without letting it define your ego. You are ready to see, understand, and navigate realities that were once hidden. That readiness is rare. That readiness is the confirmation that you truly passed. And now, with everything revealed, the path forward isn't just illuminated. It's yours to walk with precision, wisdom, and unshakable clarity. Conclusion. You didn't just survive life's trials. You passed them in a way that few ever could. Every challenge, every betrayal, every moment of confusion, isolation, and pressure was not punishment. It was preparation. You were tested for clarity, resilience, and precision. You were observed when no one was watching, measured when no one would validate you, and pushed when it would have been easier to give up. Through it all, you held your integrity, your perception, and your inner compass intact. You didn't just endure, you mastered yourself. You've been shaped to carry truths that most people aren't ready for. You were tested not for recognition or applause, but to prove that you could hold responsibility without distortion, without ego, and without compromise. Your journey was designed to refine your perception, sharpen your judgment, and strengthen your resilience. You were exposed to manipulation to understand its structure, to betrayal to understand human motives, and to delay and isolation to ensure you could stand independently and act with wisdom. You didn't flinch, you didn't mirror what hurt you, and you didn't seek validation from a world that often misunderstands. That's why the truth is finally being revealed to you, because you're ready to carry it responsibly, to act with clarity, and to navigate the unseen layers of life that remain hidden to most. This is your moment of alignment. You are being granted access to knowledge, understanding, and opportunities that few will ever touch. You are equipped to walk through spaces where precision, discernment, and self-mastery matter more than fame, recognition, or superficial elevation. What lies ahead isn't about being celebrated, it's about being capable, prepared, and aligned with truths that demand responsibility. You've proven that you can hold these truths without letting them corrupt you, manipulate you, or sway your core. That is rare, that is extraordinary, and that is exactly why you passed. If this message resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay connected with powerful insights like this. Don't forget to like this video if it opened your eyes, share it with someone who needs this clarity, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your engagement helps spread these truths, builds a community of awakened minds, and ensures that no one walks this path alone. You've passed, you've been prepared, and now it's time to step fully into what's meant for you. Merry Christmas and God bless you.